registration of births and deaths. We've got a lot to go through, and we will very shortly hand over to our facilitator, the consultant who developed the guidelines, Professor Tom Moultrie. Just quickly before we start, some housekeeping. We did actually have more than 100 registrants for this workshop, which is more than we'd originally expected. Obviously, we're very happy that there's such interest in this work, and we didn't want to, given the virtual nature of doing things, we can accommodate this. But we will need to be, I think, quite cognizant of any background noise and making sure that we keep ourselves on mute when we're not speaking in order to allow this to go forward smoothly. We didn't want to put it into the mode where everyone's muted, since we obviously would like people to ask questions and to engage in the work. So if you can, please make sure that you're muted when you're not speaking, and I think for bandwidth maybe it's better just for people who aren't speaking also to keep their cameras off, although when you are speaking we would love to see you if you are able to turn on your camera. I'm going to hand over to our director, Ms. Rachel Bevan, who is going to deliver some opening remarks to this workshop. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Petra. And yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm not quite sure where everyone is, but as Petra said, my name is Rachel Bevan, and I'm the Director of Statistics Division in ESCAP, based in Bangkok. And I've got the pleasure of welcoming you all today to this workshop, the first regional workshop on measuring the completeness of civil registration of vital events. And we're delighted to have had, as Petra said, over 100 people register for this workshop from across the region and also from across national CRVS stakeholders. And whilst we would have really loved to have actually hosted you all here in Bangkok, we miss actually being able to kind of do that in person discussion, and we know that that would have been fantastic to be able to talk in person, particularly over coffee breaks, lunch breaks, and to really get to know one another. But we know that with this virtual world that we're living in, there are also some real advantages as well. So as part of that, it does mean that we've actually been able to open up participation for this event to a much far larger number of participants, which is fantastic. So we hope that we'll be able to really benefit from actually being able to hear about diversity of context and different opinions. And we know we've got participants from Turkey all the way across the region to some. And we really are hoping that actually being able to have this much wide group of participants means that we'll be able to have much more fruitful conversations. I'd also like to take this opportunity to producing the guidelines on estimating the complete death registration, which will be an excellent resource for countries. I'm sure that this workshop will also help to actually further finalise this resource, and that means as well that the guidelines are going to be able to benefit not just people in this region, but also the wider global statistical and CRVS community. And we know that incredible progress has been made towards meeting the goals of this CRVS decade, as we saw in the ministerial conference last year. However, there were still gaps that remain, and some of these gaps are still significant. And this is especially so with regards to inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic has also brought this into much sharper focus. Inequality assessments of CRVS systems are hard to do. Estimating completeness of excluded groups is difficult. People are excluded for a reason. But if we were to meet our global commitments under the Sustainable Development Agenda and our regional commitments under the Regional Action Framework, then we have to do this. We saw during our midterm review that there is a gap in terms of guidance, capacity and support, and we're hoping that the new guidelines are a step in the right direction to filling this gap, and that this workshop will help to strengthen capacity in using them. So while we're focused here on statistics and measurement, we should also remember that CRVS has a much wider impact beyond its statistical function. It's an issue which does actually impact on people's lives in so many different ways. So also important to remember that CRVS systems themselves can be the catalyst for sustainable development. And with that, I want to wish you all the very best with your deliberations. Hope that you'll have very productive discussions, and I look forward to seeing the outcomes of this workshop. So at that point, I want to hand back, I think, to Petra.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel. And I will, with no further ado, hand over to Tom, who's going to be leading the rest of this workshop.
Good morning, all, and thank you very much to Petra and Ms. Bevan for their kind opening remarks, and welcome to everyone. As I really don't want to repeat what they've just said insofar as, you know, this is a work in progress. I think it's going to be a fabulous 5 days with all of you attending, and I really hope that at the end of it that we'll have a sense of progress, not only in terms of your own capacities to work with civil and registration vital statistics data and to estimate completeness, but also progress in further advancing the guidelines which were launched at the Stats Café earlier this morning. So without much further ado, I want to get this workshop started. We have just under an hour now, and I want to kind of give some context of where we're going and talk briefly about some of the underlying concepts. This is a workshop which one will hope is going to add value, and so I really do hope that people in this workshop, the attendees, are going to participate in the workshop. I know the time is tight. There might well be up to 100 people in the room at some point. And so we're going to have to strike a balance between kind of questions and getting through the training material. But one way or the other, we will do so, and we will ensure that kind of voices are heard. I would like to ask if people do have questions, if they don't understand, if I'm going too fast or they don't understand my accent, please raise your hand. I will be monitoring the the hands in the chat. And if you do speak, if you could just give yourself a 1 minute or 20-second introductions to who you are and where you're from, and then pose your questions. So I really do hope, and as we get further down the material, that it will become an increasingly interactive process. So we have, very kindly through Ms. Namias and Ms. Bevan, introduced the workshop. I want to give just a very brief introduction to myself. We do not, unfortunately, have time to do a tour de table for all the participants, but hopefully I will get to engage with you all over the next, over the course of the coming week. A little bit about myself. I'm a demographer by training. I hold the position of Professor of Demography at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where I've been based for the last 20 years. I'm a South African by birth as well, but I've held my position at UCT for 20 years. My interests over that period have focused on techniques for demographic estimation and how to estimate demographic parameters from limited, deficient, and defective data. For the last 2 years, however, I've done almost nothing other than think about our national response to COVID. So this is actually a welcome respite from that work, and it's nice to get back into thinking about matters far more demographic. Unfortunately, the ghost of COVID is always with us now, and it will be occasionally mentioned in the course of this workshop. I'm going to give a very brief background to the guidelines for estimating completeness of reporting of vital events. This is largely for the benefit of those who were not able to join the Stats Cafe earlier this morning or earlier this afternoon in East Asia. And then I'll give an overview of the terrain to be covered during this workshop before we actually get into the meat of things. So the background for why we're doing this, Ms. Bevan's covered it well. There's a global imperative for improving the completeness of civil registration. The SDGs have an overarching mantra of leaving no one behind, and the SDGs make particular reference to the importance of particularly of registration of every child's birth, and so that really speaks to the matter of registration of birth. But it also speaks to the importance of what are called inequality assessments in the context of civil registration. Who is being registered? Where are they being registered? And more importantly, who is not being registered? Because if they're not being registered, those populations, if there's a coherent pattern of who is not being registered, then those groups and segments of society are at risk of being left behind. Also, as Ms. Bevan noted, this work is located within the ESCAP midterm review of the framework and the program of action for vital statistics, and which had identified capacity constraints in evaluating the completeness of civil registration and vital statistics data. The map on the right-hand side of your screen there is data from the United Nations Statistics Division, showing coverage of death registration as of February last year. And really the important thing to note is that the areas shaded dark green are those areas of the world, those countries where 90% or more of deaths are being registered within the civil registration vital statistics system. And even if the legend is very small and unclear, what one can see is that there are two regions of the world particularly, which are blighted by an absence of or lack of completeness of registration of deaths. And those are Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and then also the ESCAP region. And so this is of particular salience in the context of the work which is being undertaken by ESCAP and led by the ESCAP Statistical Division. To give some roadmap of where we're going to go over the course of this week. The workshop is divided into what I'd call plenaries or instruction sessions and practical sessions. And so today, briefly, for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to talk very basically about kind of the principles of how you measure completeness, getting the basics right. What are the numerators? What are the denominators? What are the issues associated with them? On Tuesday, starting at noon Bangkok, that's tomorrow noon Bangkok time, we'll talk, the plenary sessions will cover handling of delayed registration data and the first part of how one assesses and evaluates the registration of birth completeness or birth completeness registrations. On Thursday, also at noon Bangkok, we will complete the birth registration completeness discussion and talk about death registration completeness. If you're wondering why less time is being devoted to death registration, it's merely because many of the same principles which apply to birth registration completeness can be applied almost equivalently to the question of death registration completeness. And then we'll close out the formal part of this workshop and at Friday lunchtime, 1:30 Bangkok time, where we'll close out the plenary sessions of the workshop. But surrounding that, on Wednesday and on Friday, we are going to have practical sessions. And in these sessions, I have asked, where possible, you to obtain data from your own countries to make this as realistic and as meaningful for all of you attendees as is possible. And the first session on Wednesday has a series of practical exercises which cover the first two instruction sessions of Monday and Tuesday, as well as providing opportunity for one-on-one consultations with myself by means of a breakout room within this Teams site. Likewise, on Friday, around about lunchtime Bangkok, there will be a further practical session, and then after the closeout at 1:30 on Bangkok, we'll resume again with a further practical session and with opportunity for one-on-one consultations with me, and we can discuss your data or problems you're experiencing with the implementation of the guidelines. There are several resources available in this site, and which I'd like to draw your attention to. The first is a direct link to the guidelines, which are provided there on the screen, and you can download the PDF of those guidelines. But more importantly, a Google Drive has been established for this workshop, which I've put the link there, and I'll put the link in the chat at the end of this morning's session. And I just want to quickly, if you don't mind, just switch over to what that Google Drive workshop looks like. When you go to the Google Drive on that link, it's the regional workshop on estimating completeness of civil registration of births and deaths. There are two folders, one marked meeting documents, the other one marked relevant resources. The one for relevant resources is background material which you might find useful or interesting. The more important one, though, is the documents on the meeting documents part of the website, which is has particularly here the program for the workshop, the concept note underlying the workshop. This file marked guidelines for data is a request for the attendees, each of you, to try and access what should be readily accessible data for your own country. And I'd really appreciate it if you were able to access those guidelines and try and access then the data mentioned in those guidelines, in order to make the practical sessions beginning on Wednesday as meaningful and as relevant for you as possible. Under the instructional material for the workshop on the Google Drive, there's a copy of the guidelines for estimating completeness available there, as well as on the other link. And there's at the start of every session, I will put up a PDF of the slides for this, for that session. So you'll be able to work through the material on your own afterwards, and the sessions are being recorded as well. Under practical material here, there is the PDF of the practical questions, which we're going to cover in the practical session on Wednesday. Some underlying data for the practical workshop on Wednesday if you're not able to access your own country's data, although it will be, of course, less relevant to you if you use the data which I've provided. And this file marked resources.xlsx is the associated workbook which accompanies the guidelines, and it's what we'll be using a lot of the time in going through the material. So just to give some brief, a very brief overview of what's in these guidelines, the guidelines for estimating completeness of civil registration and vital events offer a variety of kind of mechanisms and ways of thinking about how to go about estimating completeness. We talk about particularly the numerator. The numerator of any estimate of completeness is, of course, what is in your civil registration vital statistics system. And what we need to cover here are the questions, and we saw it in the Stats Café presentation from Bhutan this morning, that often countries in the developing world struggle to record all civil registration events timeously, and some of these events might be registered many years after they have occurred. And so we need to think of ways of how do we somehow accommodate what we expect to be events which have already occurred but have not yet been reported into the civil and registration vital statistics system. We also need to talk about what we do about registrations of events which occur usually towards the end of one year but are recorded in the next, and we need to make sure that those are appropriately classified. We need to talk about what is the denominator of our measure of completeness, the denominator being our estimate of the true number of events, and we need to really unpack that a bit. As I mentioned, we need to think about the impact of COVID-19 on estimating the completeness of the data, because this is going to echo not only very obviously in the assessment of completeness of death registration, but there's significant anecdotal evidence now of an impact of COVID-19 on fertility rate. as well, and that is likely then to cause some implications for